He guarded Keanu Reeves for 10 years, never missed a threat, never asked for thanks. But when Keanu found him collapsed and barely breathing, everything changed. Faced with a deadly diagnosis and no family in sight, Keanu made one quiet vow. What he did next, no one saw coming. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. Logan Ward moved like a whisper in the background of Keanu Reeves's life. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't loud, but anyone who spent more than 5 minutes around the actor quickly realized Logan was always there, standing 2 steps behind, watching the world with the precision of a man trained to see what others missed. His frame was broad, posture disciplined, and expression unreadable, like a statue carved from stone and wrapped in purpose. Keanu didn't hire people lightly, and he didn't keep them close unless they'd earned it. But Logan had been by his side for 6 years, ever since a close call with an overzealous stalker had forced Keanu to tighten his security. From premieres in New York to quiet motorcycle rides through Malibu, Logan had been the steady shadow who never faltered. Until now. It started on a Thursday morning. Keanu was heading to a charity gala in downtown Los Angeles, a small event supporting cancer research in children. He was dressed in a black suit, tie slightly loosened like he always preferred, sunglasses hiding the weariness from another long shoot the night before. Logan trailed behind, scanning the sidewalk, earpiece snug and movements tight. They turned the corner toward the waiting car when Keanu heard it, a sound so subtle it barely registered. A slip, a heel dragging slightly. He turned just in time to see Logan catch himself on the brick wall beside the parking garage. Keanu paused. "You all right?" Logan straightened quickly, nodding once. "All good, sir, just a slick patch." But the pavement was bone dry. Keanu let it slide, for the moment. That night, at the event, Logan stood by the entrance like always, alert, arms folded, eyes scanning every movement in the room. But Keanu noticed the subtle things. The way Logan leaned more heavily on one leg, how he pressed his fingers briefly into his temple when no one was looking, how his smile, rare as it was, didn't quite reach his eyes. A flicker of worry stirred in Keanu's gut. He didn't say anything. Not yet. But the signs only grew louder. By Saturday, Logan was slower to respond. When Keanu cracked a light joke, Logan's reaction was delayed. At a meeting with a director, Logan misheard a simple instruction over the radio, something that had never happened in 6 years. Keanu's concern sharpened into something more. Then came Monday morning. Keanu stepped outside his home, coffee in hand, expecting to see Logan parked by the curb like always. The sleek black SUV was missing. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Keanu called Logan's cell. No answer. A sense of unease surged through him. He dropped his coffee and got in his car. He knew where Logan lived, and something told him he had to go, now. Logan lived in a modest 2-bedroom home tucked away in a quiet Pasadena neighborhood. No frills, no pretenses, just like the man himself. Keanu had only been there once, years ago, to drop off a gift after Logan had worked through Christmas Eve to ensure Keanu's mother got home safely during a storm. Logan had been embarrassed by the gesture, insisting he was just doing his job. But Keanu had never forgotten that night. As he pulled up to the curb, he immediately knew something was wrong. Logan's car was in the driveway. The morning paper lay untouched on the porch, and the curtains, usually drawn open to let in the light, were still closed. Keanu rang the bell once. No answer. Twice. Still nothing. He stepped back, knocked harder. "Logan," he called out. "It's me." Silence. Keanu's heart pounded now, not with panic, but with the sharp, cold clarity that comes when instinct takes over. He circled around the side of the house, checked the back. Every window shut, no movement inside. Then, as he stepped back toward the front door, he noticed something. The faintest sound. A dripping faucet? No, a trickle of water and a low, rhythmic thud, like something bumping softly against tile. Keanu's hand went to the doorknob, unlocked. That was the second alarm bell. Logan never forgot to lock up. Keanu pushed the door open slowly. The house was dim, the air still and stale. A muted hum came from the TV in the living room. News on low volume left running unattended. The coffee table was undisturbed. A half-filled mug sat untouched. The whole room felt frozen in time. "Logan?" Keanu said again, stepping inside, voice firmer now. "It's Keanu." Still no answer. Then he heard it again, the faint trickle coming from the back. The kitchen? He moved fast now, following the sound past the dining nook and into the hallway. That's when he saw the sliver of light under the bathroom door. He rushed forward and pushed it open. There, collapsed on the cool tile floor, was Logan. His body lay half-curled, one arm stretched toward the vanity where his phone rested just out of reach. A glass had shattered nearby, its fragments glinting in the morning sun that now streamed through the narrow window above. The faucet ran uselessly, water pooling near the drain. "Logan!" Keanu knelt beside him, checked his pulse. It was there, faint but steady. His skin was pale, his breathing shallow. His shirt clung to him, soaked with sweat. It was as if he had tried to stand and never made it. Keanu grabbed the phone, called 911. He didn't hesitate. Not for a second. He cradled Logan's head gently off the tile, whispering, "Hang in there, man. Help's coming." The voice on the emergency line asked for the address. Keanu rattled it off, his tone sharp, clear. "Is he breathing?" the dispatcher asked. "Yes, but he's not waking up." Keanu stayed by Logan's side, listening to each shallow breath like it might be his last. Every few seconds he called his name softly, hoping to stir some flicker of consciousness. But there was nothing, just the faint rise and fall of his chest, the low hum of the faucet still running, and the buzz of tension in Keanu's chest, growing louder with each passing second. The sound of distant sirens snapped him back into motion. Keanu stood quickly and went to the front door, swinging it wide open and waving down the ambulance as it turned into the street. 2 EMTs burst through the front gate, gear in hand, all business. Keanu led them inside without a word, guiding them to the bathroom. They knelt beside Logan instantly, assessing vitals, checking his pupils, attaching monitors. One of them turned to Keanu. "Do you know what medications he's on?" Keanu shook his head. "No, he never talked about his health. Any history of seizures, diabetes, stroke?" "None that I know of," Keanu said, frustrated by how little he truly knew about the man who had protected him for nearly a decade. The EMTs exchanged glances. "He's dehydrated, pulse is weak, BP's low," one said. "Could be cardiac, could be something else. We need to move." They loaded Logan onto the stretcher with swift efficiency, securing an oxygen mask over his mouth as he stirred weakly but didn't wake. Keanu followed them outside as neighbors peeked from behind curtains. The ambulance lights flashed red and white, bouncing off the houses in silent urgency. As they loaded Logan into the back, one EMT turned to Keanu. "Are you family?" Keanu hesitated for the briefest moment, then nodded. "Yes." "Right up front," the EMT said. "We'll take it from here." Keanu climbed into the passenger seat, shutting the door just as the ambulance pulled away from the curb with a rising wail of its siren. The city blurred past outside the window, but Keanu didn't notice. His mind was fixed on Logan, on that stumble backstage, the hand trembling when no one was supposed to see. Keanu had made a career out of noticing the small things, and now all those details were crashing together into a picture that felt frighteningly incomplete. He had relied on Logan for years, never questioning the man's strength or presence, but now, with his protector unconscious in the back of an ambulance, Keanu felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Helpless. He didn't know what was wrong, he didn't know how bad it was, but one thing he knew for certain. He wasn't going to stand by and lose Logan without a fight. The hospital waiting room was too quiet. Keanu sat in a stiff plastic chair under fluorescent lights that hummed faintly overhead. Around him, a few people scrolled through their phones or whispered to loved ones, but his mind was far from the noise. His phone sat untouched in his lap, dark and silent. He hadn't called anyone, not his assistant, not his manager, not even his sister. Right now, none of that mattered. Logan was somewhere beyond those swinging double doors, and Keanu had insisted on being listed as family. The nurse had hesitated when he'd asked, "Are you immediate family?" she'd said, eyes flicking up as she glanced at the intake form. "Who doesn't have anyone?" Keanu replied. "So, yeah, I am." She didn't argue. She'd seen enough lonely patients come through those halls to know that family sometimes isn't blood. Sometimes it's earned. For the next 2 hours, Keanu barely moved. His thoughts drifted between the stumble at the charity gala, the hesitation on the stairs, the hollow look in Logan's eyes. All the signs were there, but he'd missed them, or worse, ignored them, trusting that Logan, ever silent and strong, would say something if it were serious. But Logan never complained. That wasn't who he was. He was content to lie. When the door finally opened, a woman in blue scrubs stepped out. She was in her early 40s, professional but kind-looking, with a clipboard pressed against her chest. "Mr. Reeves?" He stood immediately. "I'm Dr. Mendes. I've been treating Mr. Ward." Keanu's chest tightened. He could already hear the rehearsed language forming, the gentle tone, the measured cadence. This wasn't going to be a simple update. "Is he awake?" "He's resting," she said, "but stable for now. We ran a full panel, CBC, imaging, and a few more targeted tests because of what the EMTs reported." Keanu nodded once. He didn't ask the questions spinning in his head. He just waited. Dr. Mendes paused, then spoke carefully. "We've diagnosed him with a rare condition. It's called polycythemia vera. It's a type of blood cancer." The words hit Keanu like a slow magma punch. He didn't flinch outwardly, but inside, it felt like the floor dropped out. "What does that mean?" "It means his body is producing too many red blood cells," she said. "The blood thickens, increases clotting risks. It explains the dizziness, the fatigue, the collapse. It's a chronic condition, progressive. There's no cure, but it can be managed with the right treatment." Keanu's voice came out low. "Is it terminal?" Dr. Mendes didn't answer right away. "It can be, but not always. Early treatment can slow it down, phlebotomy, medication, monitoring, but Logan's already in an advanced stage. He's been pushing through symptoms for months." Of course he had. That was Logan, always on duty, always pushing through. "I need to see him," Keanu said. Dr. Mendes nodded. "I'll take you back." The hallway smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee. Keanu walked behind Dr. Mendes as she guided him through the maze of rooms in the intensive care wing. His boots echoed softly against the linoleum floor, each step feeling heavier than the last. His thoughts spun. Logan had a rare blood cancer, and he hadn't said a word. They stopped at room 317. The door was cracked open. A heart monitor beeped softly within, steady but ominous. "He's groggy," Dr. Mendes said gently. "We've started IV fluids and anticoagulants to stabilize his blood. He might still be a little out of it." Keanu nodded silently and stepped inside. Logan lay on the bed, an oxygen tube in his nose, a soft blanket pulled up to his chest. The man who had stood between Keanu and danger for 8 straight years now looked small beneath sterile white sheets. His skin was pale, lips dry, but his chest rose and fell steadily. As Keanu approached, Logan stirred. "Sir." His voice was weak, hoarse. "Easy," Keanu said, pulling a chair up beside the bed. "Don't talk too much." Logan blinked, trying to focus. "Where?" "You're in the hospital. You collapsed. I came to check on you, found you on the floor." Logan's eyes fluttered closed for a moment, then reopened. "Guess I overdid it." "You almost died," Keanu replied, his voice thick. Logan looked away, staring at the ceiling. It's nothing, just a blood thing. I'll be fine. Keanu leaned forward. It's not nothing, Logan. They told me. Polycythemia vera. A flash of tension crossed Logan's face. It's manageable. No, it's not. Not if you keep hiding it. I didn't want to bother anyone, Logan muttered. Didn't want to slow you down? Keanu sat back, stunned by the words. For 8 years, Logan had sacrificed sleep, privacy, personal time. He'd taken bullets in training exercises, broken ribs in a freak car accident, and never once complained. Now, here he was, minimizing a life-threatening illness as though it were a twisted ankle. You've spent years keeping me safe, Keanu said finally, his voice low but firm. Let me do the same. Logan looked at him, something flickering behind his tired eyes. I don't want your pity. This isn't pity, Keanu replied. It's respect. Silence fell between them, deep and loaded. Then Logan gave a soft sigh. I don't even know where to begin, he whispered. Then start here, Keanu said, reaching for the small notebook that lay on the table beside the bed. With letting someone stay. The hallway leading to Logan's room was long and dimly lit, the floor polished to a mirror-like sheen. Keanu followed silently, his boots echoing softly with each step. He'd walked red carpets, war zones in film, and hospital corridors before, but none of those felt like this. This one felt personal. When they reached room 214, Dr. Mendez gave him a small nod and opened the door gently. Logan lay in the hospital bed, pale and still, IV tubes running into the crook of his arm. His chest rose and fell steadily, but his face had lost its usual strength, the quiet alertness that defined him. He looked human, vulnerable. That shook Keanu more than anything. As he stepped closer, Logan stirred. Sir? His voice was raspy, like sandpaper across stone. You didn't need to come. Keanu pulled the single plastic chair closer to the bed and sat. You didn't show up this morning. I was worried. Logan gave a faint smile. Figured I could take one sick day in 10 years? You collapsed, Logan, Keanu said. His voice wasn't angry, but it wasn't calm either. It hovered between fear and disbelief. At home, alone. You could have died. Logan shifted, discomfort flashing across his face, not from pain, but from the attention. I was managing it. What is it? Logan's eyes flickered toward the doorway, as if trying to escape the moment. Polycythemia vera, blood cancer, diagnosed a few months ago. I didn't want to burden anyone. Keanu stared at him. You've been walking around with this for months? Why didn't you say something? Because it's not your problem, Logan said quietly. My job is to protect you, not the other way around. Keanu shook his head slowly. That's not how this works, not with me. Logan closed his eyes for a long moment, the weight of everything settling on him. There's a treatment plan. I was handling it until I wasn't. Keanu leaned forward, elbows on knees. You've spent years putting yourself between me and everything dangerous, every threat, every stalker, every moment of chaos. You've had my back in silence. Logan didn't respond. He didn't have to. Keanu's voice dropped, but it held a quiet force. Let me return the favor. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the faint beeping of the monitors. Logan opened his eyes and looked at Keanu. Really looked at him. I'm not good at asking for help, he said. I noticed, Keanu replied gently. Logan chuckled once, then winced. I've got savings, some VA coverage. I'll be fine. No, Keanu said firmly. You'll be more than fine. You're not going to fight this alone in silence and hope for the best. Not while I'm still breathing. Logan's brows furrowed. This isn't your responsibility. I know, Keanu said. That's why it matters even more. The door creaked open and a nurse stepped in briefly to adjust Logan's IV. She offered a soft smile at Keanu before exiting again, closing the door behind her. Keanu sat back in his chair, eyes fixed on Logan. "You didn't just work for me, Logan. You watched over me, even when I didn't notice. That kind of loyalty? That's rare. I was just doing my job." "You did more than that," Keanu said. "You gave me peace of mind I didn't know I needed. You let me be Keanu Reeves without looking over my shoulder." Logan looked away, jaw tight. "I don't want pity." "This isn't pity," Keanu said. "It's gratitude." The room fell silent again. Finally, Keanu stood. "Rest tonight. Tomorrow we talk next steps. We fight this thing. Together." Logan blinked up at him, quiet. Then, with a nod, almost imperceptible, he whispered, "Okay." As Keanu left the room, he didn't stop at the elevator. He headed straight to the nurse's station. "I need to speak with Dr. Mendez again," he said. "Of course, Mr. Reeves," the nurse replied. "I'll page her right away." Because the man who had spent years protecting Keanu from the shadows was now the one in danger, and Keanu wasn't about to let him face that danger alone. The hallway outside Logan's hospital room was silent, but Keanu's mind wasn't. He stood still, back pressed lightly against the wall, fists clenched at his sides. The words, "rare blood cancer," echoed like a slow burn in his chest. Polycythemia vera. The doctor had said it, calmly, clinically, but it had dropped like a bomb inside Keanu. He stared at the blank floor tiles, but what he saw was not the present. His memory drifted, unbidden, to another hospital, another night, years earlier. It was 2016, somewhere outside Budapest. They were filming a tense action thriller, Keanu doing most of his stunts, much to Logan's disapproval. The production had run late that day. By the time they wrapped, it was well after midnight. Keanu remembered the cold, the way mist clung to the ground like smoke. They were walking back to the trailer when it happened. A man emerged from the shadows. Not a crew member, not anyone Keanu recognized. He didn't say a word, just raised a hand. In it was a small silver pistol. Time slowed. Keanu barely registered what was happening before Logan stepped forward. Instinct, not thought. Training, not fear. Logan shoved Keanu back just as the shot rang out. It sounded like a firecracker, but the sight of blood was no illusion. Logan grunted and fell to one knee, gripping his side. The attacker fled into the trees as security scrambled, but Keanu saw only Logan, eyes narrowed, breathing shallow, but alive. The bullet had grazed his ribs, torn through muscle. It could have been worse, but it could have been fatal. Keanu never forgot that night, never forgot the sound of Logan's voice later in the ER, groggy but steady. "1 inch to the left, sir." "That's all it would have taken," Keanu had replied. "Don't call me sir." Logan had smirked, despite the pain. That scar, hidden beneath Logan's ribs, had faded, but the moment hadn't. It lived in Keanu's bones. Now, years later, Logan was the one in the bed, weak, pale, fighting something silent and insidious. And Keanu couldn't just sit and watch. Back in the present, he turned from the wall and walked down the hallway, his jaw set. He had to do something. Within the hour, Keanu was back in his car, alone. The city shimmered around him, traffic lights blinking like tired eyes. He ignored the vibration of incoming texts from producers, his assistant, his agent. The world of films and press junkets could wait. He canceled everything. A film in pre-production, an award ceremony, a charity event in Montreal, gone with a single call. His assistant's voice crackled in disbelief. "Keanu, the studio will flip. They can wait," he said. "Logan can't." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The finality in his tone left no room for argument. Then he got to work. Keanu wasn't a doctor. He didn't understand the science of blood cancer, but he understood urgency. He understood love, repaid with action. So he started calling people. Real people, not handlers, not names from headlines, quiet contacts from years of private charity donations and quiet medical philanthropy. He called the director of a medical research center in Boston. He called the head of a nonprofit that focused on rare cancers. He called in favors he'd never used. But it all led to the same name: Dr. Elena Ramirez, a specialist in hematologic oncology, one of the best minds in the world when it came to rare blood cancers. She ran an elite treatment program at a research hospital in New York. It took Keanu 6 hours to reach her, not through PR channels or email chains, but directly. She answered her phone on the 4th ring. Her voice was brisk but not cold. "Dr. Ramirez, this is Keanu Reeves. I need your help." A pause. "Is this about Logan Ward?" she asked. Keanu blinked. "You know him?" "I know of him," she said. "A colleague forwarded his test results this morning. Polycythemia vera, advanced stage. He should have come in weeks ago." "Wouldn't," Keanu said. "He's not the type." There was something quiet in Dr. Ramirez's response, an understanding most warriors never are. Keanu leaned against the counter of his kitchen, voice low. "Can you take him?" "I can evaluate him," she said. "He'd have to be transferred here, soon. The sooner we start, the better the outcome." "I'll get him there," Keanu promised. "Just be straight with me. Is there hope?" Another pause, then, "If he's willing to fight, we'll fight with him." Keanu ended the call and stood in the quiet of his home. Outside, night had swallowed the sky. Inside, he stood still for a long time, letting everything settle. Then he whispered aloud to no one but himself, "I owe this man everything." The next morning, Keanu returned to the hospital. Logan was awake, propped up in bed, watching the news on mute. He looked better, but Keanu had known him too long to be fooled by appearances. Logan gave a faint smirk. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon." Keanu pulled up the chair. "I'm transferring you to New York." Logan raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "I found a doctor, Elena Ramirez. She's the best. You're flying out tomorrow." Logan sat up straighter, frowning. "Keanu?" "This isn't a discussion," Keanu said softly. "You saved my life. Let me try to save yours." Logan shook his head. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not. I don't want charity." "It's not charity," Keanu said. "It's respect. And a promise." Logan stared at him for a long moment. "You're really doing this?" "I already did." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with everything they didn't need to say out loud. Finally, Logan leaned back, closed his eyes. "All right." That night, Keanu booked the flight, not a jet, but a discreet private carrier specializing in medical transfers. He didn't want press, didn't want anyone watching. This wasn't a spectacle. This was personal. He also arranged an apartment in New York, near the hospital, quiet, comfortable. He wouldn't be staying at a hotel. He wanted to be close. While Logan slept, Keanu sat beside the bed and made a list on a yellow notepad. Specialists, meals, books Logan might like. He jotted it all down, not as an obligation, but as instinct. Each item was a piece of the promise. In the morning, Keanu returned home briefly to pack. As he moved through the quiet rooms, he paused at a shelf in his office. Sitting on it was a framed photo, taken years ago on set. Keanu in costume. Logan, just behind him, partially cropped, half in shadow. He picked up the photo and looked at it for a long time. Most people would miss Logan in that picture. But Keanu never had. That was the point. The man who stood behind the spotlight. The man who watched, listened, acted, before danger even had a name. Now that man needed someone to step into the light for him. Keanu put the frame into his bag. By the time he returned to the hospital, Logan was ready. Quietly packed, steady as always, but Keanu could see the fatigue in his eyes. "You sure about this?" Logan asked once. Keanu nodded. "Absolutely." Together, they walked toward the transport vehicle waiting outside. As they passed through the sliding glass doors, Keanu glanced back once at the hospital, the place where everything had shifted. Then he looked ahead, at Logan, moving a little slower than usual, but still upright, still fighting. And he made the vow again, not aloud, but in the marrow of his soul. I owe this man everything, and I won't let him go through this alone. The airport was quiet at dawn, tucked between darkness and light, just like the man standing beside Keanu at the private terminal. Logan Ward, dressed in a simple dark hoodie and jeans, looked more like a tired traveler than a man walking into a fight for his life. Keanu stood beside him, arms crossed, watching the medical personnel prepare the small aircraft on the tarmac. The flight crew had been hand-picked, trained in patient transport, quiet and professional. No cameras, no noise, no fuss. Just focus, just respect. But Logan wasn't looking at the plane, he was looking at Keanu. "I still don't feel right about this," he said. His voice was steady, but there was an edge of tension under it. "All this for me? A chartered medical jet? An apartment in New York? It's too much." Keanu didn't answer right away. He let the wind move between them, cool and dry. Then he said, "This isn't charity, Logan. It's respect." Logan's jaw flexed. "I've worked for a lot of people," he said. "Protected politicians, CEOs. None of them would have done this." Keanu looked at him. "Then they didn't understand what you're worth." Logan scoffed lightly. "Worth?" He shook his head. "I'm a bodyguard, man. A glorified shadow." Keanu stepped closer. "No. You're a man who's taken bullets, skipped holidays, and given 10 years of your life making sure someone else lived theirs safely. That's not a shadow, that's a shield. And now, that shield needs some armor of its own." Logan was quiet for a long time. He looked back at the plane. I don't know how to be the one getting protected." "You don't have to," Keanu said. "You just have to let me be there." The flight to New York was smooth, but the atmosphere inside the cabin was heavy. Logan sat quietly, staring out the window, arms crossed, his face unreadable. Keanu, seated across from him, didn't press. He worked through some notes for an upcoming script, occasionally glancing up to check on Logan. They didn't speak much, but the silence wasn't cold. It was familiar. Dr. Elena Ramirez met them at the private intake wing of the research hospital in Manhattan. She wore her hair in a tight bun, her white coat spotless, her eyes sharp with intelligence. "You must be Logan Ward," she said, extending her hand. Logan took it, firm and direct. Keanu stayed a step back as she led them to the evaluation room. Blood work was ordered, imaging scans followed. Within 2 hours, Logan was admitted to the specialized oncology unit. The first night was calm. Keanu stayed in the room beside him, a small chair pulled close to the bed, laptop balanced on his knees. He didn't sleep much. He wrote, mostly dialogue, for a character that felt miles away from the hospital walls. Every so often, he'd look over and check the monitor, listen to Logan's breathing, watch the slow drip of the IV. The next morning, the treatment began. It started with phlebotomy, blood draws to reduce the red blood cell count. Logan sat through it with his usual stillness, jaw tight, eyes locked on the corner of the ceiling. Dr. Ramirez explained every step, but Logan barely responded. He didn't ask questions, didn't complain. But the toll showed quickly. By day 3, fatigue weighed on him like a sandbag. His legs felt heavier, his hands trembled slightly when he tried to tie his shoes, Keanu noticed, even when Logan tried to hide it. "Let me help," Keanu said quietly, kneeling beside him that morning. "I got it," Logan replied, frustrated at his own weakness. "I know," Keanu said, "but you don't have to." They didn't speak again for a while, but Logan let him tie the shoes. On the 5th day, nausea set in from the hydroxyurea, oral chemotherapy used to control his blood cell production. He barely touched the meals brought by the hospital staff. Keanu started bringing in food from nearby cafes. Simple broth, ginger tea, fruit in small bowls. Most of it went untouched, but Logan appreciated the effort in the silence between them. One night, around 2 a.m., Keanu sat in the darkened room, the only light coming from the faint glow of the hallway outside. Logan stirred, sweating through his hospital gown, chest rising and falling unevenly. Keanu stood immediately, placing a damp cloth across his forehead. Logan opened his eyes, groggy. "You're still here?" Keanu smiled faintly. "You thought I wouldn't be?" Logan's voice cracked. "Didn't expect it." "Well," Keanu said, pulling the blanket higher over him, "get used to it." They both chuckled, quietly, tiredly, but it was the first time Logan had smiled in days. The days blurred together. Keanu kept a rhythm: arrive early, stay late. In between checkups and treatments, he worked on rewrites for a postponed film. He set up a small folding desk by the window in Logan's room and typed softly, taking breaks whenever Logan needed something. Some days Logan was more alert. On those days, they talked. Not about cancer, not about the future, just about life, music, old movies, football. Keanu brought a portable speaker and played jazz during the evenings. Sometimes Logan would close his eyes and just listen, the tension in his shoulders loosening slightly. Other nights, Keanu would read to him, short stories, military memoirs, even old sci-fi paperbacks Logan had once mentioned liking. But then there were the hard nights. The nights when the medication twisted in Logan's gut, when his body shook from exhaustion and nausea, and the only sound was the muted moan of discomfort in the dark. On those nights, Keanu didn't speak. He just sat close, within reach, a hand on the shoulder, a presence, nothing more. He knew what silence could mean. It didn't always mean absence. Sometimes it meant strength. By the second week, Logan had lost noticeable weight. His face had thinned, dark circles ringing his eyes. But there was something else, too. A quiet acceptance, not of defeat, but of reality, of vulnerability. One morning, while the nurse changed his IV, Logan looked at Keanu and said softly, "You know, I wouldn't be here without you." Keanu didn't answer right away. He set down his coffee and walked to the window. "I know," he finally said, "and that's exactly why I am." There was no need to say more. In that moment, they both understood what this really was. Not a repayment, not a debt, a promise. Made years ago, when Logan had thrown himself between Keanu and a bullet, and now honored, not in grand gestures or headlines, but in the quiet grind of hospital days, the muted courage of treatment, and the enduring presence of someone who refused to walk away. The third week in New York passed in a haze of treatments, restless nights, and quiet routines. Outside Logan's hospital window, the city surged forward, cars blaring, sirens wailing, the blur of motion never ceasing. But inside room 428, time moved slower. It didn't crawl or fly. It simply hovered, suspended between hope and fear. Keanu showed up every morning just after sunrise. He'd bring coffee, black for him, ginger tea for Logan, and sit in the same chair by the window. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. But the rhythm of presence was steady, and it had started to soften the guarded edges in Logan's expression. One afternoon, Logan was feeling well enough to sit upright in the recliner by the window. The IV still trailed from his arm, but there was more color in his face and his breathing was less labored. Keanu sat across from him, flipping through a worn paperback novel, when Logan spoke without warning. "You ever think about the people you left behind?" Keanu looked up, his thumb holding his place in the book. "Sometimes," he said. "Why?" Logan stared out the window for a long moment before answering. "I have a brother, Marcus. We haven't spoken in 7 years, maybe more." Keanu leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "What happened?" Logan shrugged. "Same thing that happens to a lot of families. Life, pride, misunderstandings that grow into silence." He paused, his voice lower. "Our dad died when we were young. I joined the Marines right out of high school. Marcus stayed back, tried to hold the family together. But I didn't make it easy. Missed birthdays, missed our mom's funeral, missed everything really. There was no bitterness in Logan's voice, just weariness. After my second tour, I tried to reach out, he continued. But by then, he didn't want to hear it. Said I only called when I needed something. And maybe he was right. Keanu said nothing. He knew when to listen. I've thought about calling him again, Logan said, voice rough. But I figured, what's the point? What would I even say? Keanu studied him. Maybe the point isn't what you say. Maybe it's that you say something at all. Logan nodded faintly, the weight of regret visible in his shoulders. He's probably better off without me. Everyone is. Keanu shook his head. That's not true. I don't believe that. And I don't think you do either. The words hung in the air, heavy, true. Later that evening, when the nurses dimmed the lights and the monitors blinked quietly, Keanu shared something he rarely talked about. He sat beside Logan, the glow of the city behind him, and spoke softly. I lost someone too, he said. Years ago, a close friend. We grew up together. She was everything. Kind, funny, smarter than anyone I knew. We were inseparable. Logan glanced at him. What happened? Car crash, Keanu said simply. She was gone in seconds. 1 minute we were planning a trip to Italy, and the next, I was alone. There was a long silence before Keanu continued. I blamed myself for not being there, for not calling that night, for everything I should have said and didn't. Took me years to stop waking up in the middle of the night expecting to hear her laugh. Logan looked down at his hands. You ever reach a point where it stops hurting? Keanu met his eyes. It never stops hurting, but it gets quieter. You learn to live with the echo. Logan nodded. That's how I feel about Marcus. Like he's always there in the background, just muted. The conversation didn't go further that night. It didn't need to. Something unspoken had passed between them. Shared loss, shared silence. And in that space, their bond deepened. But life, like healing, rarely moves in a straight line. 3 nights later, Logan had a setback. It started with a fever, low grade but stubborn. Dr. Ramirez adjusted his medications, but by the following evening, Logan's temperature spiked to 102. He began shivering violently, his skin pale and clammy. The nurses moved fast, checking for infection, adjusting fluids, ordering blood cultures. Keanu had just returned from picking up food when he walked into the room and froze. Logan lay twisted in the bed, sweat beading on his brow, eyes closed tightly in pain. The monitors beeped faster, and 2 nurses hovered beside him, one on the phone calling Ramirez. Keanu dropped the bag and stepped forward. What happened? He's spiked a high-grade fever, one nurse said quickly. Heart rate's climbing. We're monitoring for sepsis. Keanu's pulse roared in his ears. Is Ramirez on her way? She's on call. She'll be here within the hour. Keanu didn't wait. He stepped into the hallway, pulled out his phone, and called her directly. She answered on the second ring. Keanu? It's happening, he said, trying to keep his voice even. He's crashing. You need to come. Now. I'm already en route, she assured. We'll do everything we can. No, Keanu said, voice cracking for the first time. Do whatever it takes. Please. There was a pause on the line. Then, softly, I will. Keanu hung up and stood in the hallway, hands trembling slightly. He wasn't used to this kind of fear. He'd been through shootouts in films, staged explosions, stunt work gone wrong, but none of it compared to the helplessness of watching someone he cared about fade in real time. Back inside the room, Logan stirred. He'd heard it. His voice was faint, barely audible. You don't have to do this. Keanu stepped close, brushing damp hair from Logan's forehead. I do. Because I can. Logan's eyes fluttered. You're supposed to be the quiet one. Keanu smiled, even as his throat tightened. Not tonight. Dr. Ramirez arrived 15 minutes later, moving like a force of nature. She issued orders, reviewed charts, started a new antibiotic regimen, and stayed in the room well past midnight. The fever came down slowly, then stabilized. By morning, Logan was resting again. Keanu hadn't left his side. As sunlight crept through the blinds, Logan opened his eyes slowly. His voice was scratchy. "I heard you," he said. Keanu looked at him. "Yeah? When you were on the phone." Logan turned his head. "Didn't think I'd ever hear you sound like that." Keanu nodded, quiet. "Neither did I." They both sat in silence for a long time. Then Logan spoke again, voice low. "I think I want to call Marcus." Keanu blinked. "Yeah?" Logan nodded slowly. "If this thing takes me, I don't want to go without saying something, even if it's just, 'I'm sorry.'" Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'll help you find him." Logan looked at him, a mix of gratitude and fear in his eyes. "What if he doesn't pick up?" Keanu's voice was steady. "Then we try again, until he does." Outside, the city kept moving, but inside that hospital room, something had shifted. Logan Ward, the silent shield, the man who never asked for anything, was beginning to let the world in. And Keanu Reeves, the man used to standing alone in the spotlight, was becoming the light for someone else. Together they sat in that fragile morning, not as star and bodyguard, not as patient and caregiver, but as two men slowly pulling down the masks they'd worn for too long. The storm had passed, but the aftershocks still lingered. Logan's fever had broken, but his body felt like a battlefield, aching, drained, trembling from the inside out. Keanu stayed close, never pushing, but always near. That morning, as light filtered through the blinds, Dr. Ramirez came in with a clipboard and a careful expression. She stood at the foot of Logan's bed and took a breath before speaking. "We've reviewed all of your lab results again," she said. "The treatments are helping, but they're not enough. Not long term." Logan met her eyes calmly. "What's next?" Her voice softened. "You need a bone marrow transplant." Logan blinked slowly. He didn't flinch or curse or panic. He just nodded once, like he'd expected this answer all along. Dr. Ramirez continued. "The best success rate comes from a matched sibling donor, full or half-blood relatives. Do you have any immediate family?" Logan's silence said everything. Keanu answered for him. "He has a brother, half-brother, Marcus." Ramirez nodded, hopeful. "If he's willing to be tested, that could be the best shot." Logan didn't respond. His jaw tensed, eyes focused on a point somewhere far beyond the room. When Ramirez left, Keanu sat back down and waited. The silence was different now, thick with unspoken questions. Finally, Keanu broke it. "You said you wanted to reach out to him." Logan nodded slowly. "I did. But calling and asking for forgiveness is one thing. Calling and asking for bone marrow? That's something else." "You're not asking for a favor," Keanu said gently. "You're giving him a chance to matter, a chance to show up." Logan gave a faint, bitter smile. "You really think I mean that much to him anymore?" Keanu met his eyes. "I think you'll never know, unless you try." That afternoon, Keanu made a call of his own. He didn't go through public records or online searches. He called someone he trusted, an old friend from Toronto who now ran a discreet private investigation firm specializing in high-profile cases. The man owed Keanu a favor. This was the time to cash it in. "I need you to find someone," Keanu said. "Name's Marcus Ward, last known state Colorado, no contact in years. He's my friend's half-brother." "Give me 24 hours, came the reply. Keanu hung up and returned to Logan's bedside. He didn't mention the call, not yet. The next morning, his phone buzzed with a short text. "Got him. Boulder, Colorado, assistant college football coach, no criminal record, lives alone. Want the number?" Keanu stared at the message for a moment, then walked over to Logan's window and looked out at the skyline. Then he turned around and said, "We found him." Logan looked up, eyes narrowing. "Marcus?" "Yeah," He's in Boulder, working at a college, clean life, stable. I have his phone number. Logan turned his face toward the ceiling, exhaling slowly. You really did it. I told you I would. The pause that followed was long and loaded. Finally, Logan said, I don't know if I can call him. Keanu nodded. Then I will. Logan sat up straighter. No, I should be the one. I just need a second. Keanu handed him the phone and stepped out of the room. 15 minutes passed, then 20. When Keanu returned, Logan was sitting quietly, the phone in his lap, face unreadable. Picked up, Logan said softly. Didn't hang up, just listened. Keanu sat beside him. I told him I was sick, that I might need a transplant. Told him I wasn't trying to gild him, just trying to be honest. Keanu waited. Logan looked over. He said he'd think about it. That's not a no. No, Logan said. But it's not a yes either. 2 days later, Marcus called the hospital. He spoke to a nurse, gave his consent to be tested, and booked a flight. Logan didn't show it, but something in his posture changed. His shoulders relaxed by a fraction, his breathing a little steadier. When the day came, Keanu stayed in the waiting area while Logan sat in the consultation room, heart pounding. The door finally opened, and Marcus Ward stepped inside. He looked different than Logan remembered. Thicker build, trimmed beard, a few more lines around the eyes. But those eyes were unmistakable. The same ones he'd stared into when they were kids building forts in the woods. The same ones that had watched him walk away after their last argument. Neither man spoke for a moment. Then Marcus crossed the room and extended his hand. Logan took it. The moment held. Thanks for coming, Logan said quietly. Marcus nodded. You sounded different. On the phone, I mean. Softer. Tired. I am, Logan admitted. You said it's cancer? Logan nodded. Blood cancer. They say I need a transplant. They checked the registry, no match. You're the only shot I've got. Marcus took a breath. That's a hell of a reason to reconnect. I know. Marcus didn't look away. But I'm here, and I'll do the test. The rest of the visit passed quietly. A nurse came in to collect the blood sample, and Marcus sat beside Logan for the first time in a decade. They didn't talk much, but the silence didn't bite like it used to. When Marcus left, he paused at the door. Logan, he said, I don't know what's going to happen, but if you're serious about making things right, I'm open to it. Even if the test doesn't work out. Logan looked up, eyes glassy. I'm serious. Marcus nodded. Then we'll take it from there. Keanu found Logan later that night sitting up in bed, staring at the ceiling. How'd it go? He asked. Logan smiled faintly. Better than expected. He didn't throw a chair or walk out. Keanu chuckled. That's progress. Said he'd try. Logan murmured. I think that's all I can ask for. 3 days later, Dr. Ramirez walked into the room with a thin folder in her hand. She looked tired, but there was a flicker of optimism in her eyes. Well, Logan asked. She opened the folder. Marcus is a match. Not perfect, but good enough. Keanu exhaled sharply. Logan blinked in disbelief. He's really a match? Close enough to proceed safely, she confirmed. We'll begin prep immediately. The room fell into silence. But this time, the silence didn't carry fear. It carried hope. Later that evening, Logan sat beside the window, IV trailing from his arm, watching dusk fall over the city. Keanu joined him, setting down 2 mugs, coffee for himself, warm broth for Logan. You ever think, Logan said, about how strange life is? How one phone call, 1 second of courage, can change everything? All the time, Keanu said. I was ready to die alone, Logan admitted. Not because I wanted to, but because I thought I deserved it. Keanu shook his head. No one deserves to die alone. Maybe not, Logan said. But when you burn bridges long enough, you forget how to swim back. You didn't burn them all, Keanu said. You just stopped looking for the shoreline. Logan smiled. "And you helped me find it again." Keanu looked at him. "You found it. I just lit the way." That night, Keanu stayed until Logan fell asleep. The city hummed outside, the lights from passing taxis painting soft gold across the floor. And for the first time since this all began, Keanu felt something rise in his chest. Not relief, not victory, but possibility. Logan had reached out into the darkness, and someone had reached back. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and winter-cool air drifting in through the glass, mingling with the distant buzz of machines. Logan sat in a wheelchair by the window, wrapped in a gray fleece blanket, his IV pole standing like a sentinel beside him. He looked out at the street below, watching people live their lives, unaware of the storm in his own. Keanu was nearby, quietly typing on his laptop, working on a script revision, but he kept glancing up, watching Logan. Waiting. The elevator dinged down the hall. A moment later, Marcus Ward stepped into the room. He paused in the doorway, hat in hand, eyes scanning his older brother's face. Logan turned slowly and met his gaze. They stared at each other for a long time. Two men who had shared the same blood, but grown apart like strangers on different roads. Marcus was taller than Logan remembered, broader. His beard was neater than before, but the lines around his eyes had deepened. Life had marked him too. "You look like hell," Marcus said quietly. Logan managed a smirk. "That's the general consensus." Marcus stepped farther into the room, his boots echoing against the tile. "How long has it been?" 8 years, Logan replied, "give or take." Marcus nodded once. "You didn't sound like yourself on the phone." "I'm not myself right now," Logan said. "But I'm still me." A pause. Then Marcus pulled the extra chair closer and sat down across from him. They didn't shake hands. They didn't need to. Logan cleared his throat. "I didn't call to make things weird. I just didn't know who else to call. You could have called years ago." "I know." They sat in the silence that followed, not comfortable, not hostile, just the space where words were hard to find after so many years of not speaking. Keanu stood quietly from the side and approached them with a respectful nod. "Hey," he said gently, offering his hand. "I'm Keanu." Marcus raised an eyebrow and shook it. "Yeah, I figured." Keanu smiled faintly and stepped back, giving the brothers space again. Marcus looked back at Logan. "Why is he here? All this—" He gestured around the room. At the top floor, private care, the high-tech monitors, the man standing nearby like family. "Why is this movie star doing all this for you?" Logan didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted to Keanu, then back to his brother. "Because he's not just a movie star," Logan said. "He's the reason I'm still breathing." Marcus looked confused, but Logan pressed forward, voice steady now. "Hell, doesn't brag about it, but Keanu's been here every day. Every appointment, every setback, every late-night fever and quiet morning when I couldn't lift my head. I took a bullet for him once. Years ago. I thought that was the biggest thing I'd ever do in my life." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You took a bullet?" Logan nodded. "Didn't even think twice. It was my job. And now he's doing his," Marcus said quietly. "In reverse." Logan's voice cracked slightly. "No one's ever shown up for me like that before. Not like this." The room grew quiet. Then the nurse entered and gently reminded Marcus it was time for the blood test. She led him down the hall, and Logan sat back in the chair, watching him go. Keanu moved to stand beside him. "How are you holding up?" he asked. Logan nodded. "Better now. That went better than I expected." "He's a good man," Keanu said. "Yeah," Logan whispered. "He is." They waited. Hours passed. The test would take a few days, but it didn't stop the tension from settling like a fog. Every phone buzz made Logan's chest tighten. Every passing conversation outside the door made him listen harder, hoping, then disappointed. Keanu stayed, as usual. They watched documentaries together, played chess on a small travel board Keanu had brought, talked about nothing and everything. But underneath it all, the unspoken question lingered. Would Marcus be a match? On the third morning, Dr. Ramirez entered the room, holding a thin folder. Her expression was unreadable, but her steps were swift. Keanu stood, and Logan pushed himself upright in the bed. "Well?" Logan asked, barely breathing. Dr. Ramirez smiled. "Just slightly. It's not a perfect match, but it's good. Good enough." Logan exhaled like someone had been holding him underwater. Keanu closed his eyes in silent relief. Marcus stepped into the room behind the doctor, hands in his pockets, a quiet nod in place of celebration. "I figured I'd be useless," Marcus said, almost sheepishly. "Guess I was wrong." Logan looked at him, emotion flickering behind his eyes. "You were never useless." Marcus met his gaze. "So, what now?" Dr. Ramirez stepped forward. "Now we begin the coordination for the transplant. It won't happen tomorrow. There's prep for both of you, but it's possible. And it's promising." She left the room, letting the brothers have a moment. Keanu backed away slightly, but Marcus waved him closer. "I think you've earned the right to stay in this conversation," Marcus said. Keanu smiled. "I'll take that." Marcus looked back at Logan. "If we're doing this, then after, maybe we keep talking. Doesn't have to be deep, just not radio silence." Logan's voice was steady. "I'd like that." The air in the room shifted, subtle but real. Something heavy had been lifted, replaced by a cautious hope neither man had felt in years. As Marcus turned to leave, he paused and looked at Keanu again. "I don't know what your angle is," he said, "but you're a good man." Keanu shrugged. "There's no angle, just doing for him what he's done for me." Marcus nodded slowly. "Then I owe you too." Keanu shook his head. "No debts here, just people doing the right thing." Logan watched the exchange with something close to wonder. For years, he'd seen the world through the lens of duty. Protect and serve. Don't get attached. Don't expect help. Don't expect healing. But in that hospital room, things were beginning to shift. The man who never expected anyone to show up was learning what it felt like to be chosen, to be fought for. And for the first time in a long time, Logan didn't feel like a soldier with a mission. He felt like a man with a future. The calendar on the hospital wall now had a date circled in red. March 14th, the day of the transplant. It was written in small, neat handwriting, courtesy of the night nurse who thought it might help Logan visualize the finish line. But every time Logan looked at it, he didn't feel relieved. He felt something else. Terror. He hadn't said it out loud, not even to Keanu. But in the quiet moments between nurses checking vitals and Keanu cracking a dry joke to lift the mood, the fear crawled in, like a cold draft under a locked door. Because the truth was, this was the closest he'd ever been to losing everything. And now, it was also the closest he'd ever been to getting it all back. That was the terrifying part. Keanu noticed the change. He noticed how Logan sat longer at the window, how he hesitated when talking about after. He noticed how Logan, once composed in the face of danger, was now quieter. He didn't push, but he didn't stay silent either. The night before the procedure, Keanu wheeled in a Bluetooth speaker and placed it on the bedside table. "What's this?" Logan asked, his voice faint. "You like Miles Davis, right?" Keanu asked. "Figured you might sleep better with some brass instead of beeping machines." Logan smiled weakly. "I'm not gonna sleep much tonight." Keanu nodded. "Then we'll just sit here and listen together." And they did. For hours. No scripts, no phone calls, no distractions. Just two men, one night, and the soft echo of jazz drifting through the sterile hospital room. At 5:45 a.m., the nurses came in. Everything moved quickly. Logan was prepped. Marcus had already been taken to a different wing, and the transplant team began their final checks. Logan lay on the gurney, the IV line already taped to his arm, and stared up at the ceiling tiles, like they might give him the strength he hadn't found in himself. Keanu stood beside him, one hand resting on the railing. Logan turned his head slightly. What if it doesn't work? Keanu looked him straight in the eyes. Then, we try something else. But it's going to work. You can't promise that. No, Keanu said softly. But I can promise I'll be here either way. Logan's throat tightened. He nodded once, then closed his eyes. They rolled him away. The procedure took over 3 hours. Keanu sat in the waiting room the entire time, a dog-eared copy of The Old Man and the Sea resting in his lap. He didn't read a single page. He just held it, like it was something to anchor him in place. When Dr. Ramirez finally appeared, she gave him a tight, tired smile. It went well, she said. No complications. Cells have been introduced. Now we wait. The waiting was the hardest part. For the next 10 days, Keanu returned to the hospital every morning and left only when the nurses insisted he needed sleep. Logan was weak, immunocompromised, and monitored round the clock. Every day they checked his white blood cell count, looking for signs that Marcus's marrow was engrafting, that the cells were starting to produce healthy blood. Some days were encouraging. Others, not so much. On day 3, Logan spiked another fever. Keanu sat at his bedside for 9 hours straight, wiping his forehead with a cold cloth while the team adjusted his antibiotics. On day 5, Logan barely opened his eyes. His voice was down to a whisper. You know what this reminds me of? He croaked. Keanu leaned closer. What? That cave scene in The Empire Strikes Back, when Luke almost freezes to death and Han cuts open the tauntaun to keep him warm. Keanu chuckled. You're saying I'm the tauntaun in this scenario? Logan gave the faintest smile. Just saying. Thanks for not letting me freeze. Day 7 brought a small miracle. The lab results showed early signs of engraftment. The cells were taking hold. Dr. Ramirez delivered the news cautiously, but her eyes betrayed her hope. We're not out of the woods, she said, but this is the first sign we needed. Keanu brought Logan the news himself. He sat beside him, held his hand, and simply said, You're doing it, man. Your body's fighting. Logan closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek. I didn't think I'd make it this far. You did, Keanu said, and you're not done yet. They passed the time with music, old war movies, and stories from both their pasts. Keanu read to him, sometimes from classic novels, sometimes from fan letters sent over the years. Logan especially liked the letters from kids who'd written in after Keanu visited children's hospitals. They talk about you like you're Superman, Logan said one night. Keanu smiled. They talk about hope. That's all I want to be part of. You're doing more than that, Logan said. You're living it. Each day, Logan grew a little stronger. By day 10, he could sit up on his own for extended periods. By day 12, he was able to take a few steps with the help of a walker. Keanu was always nearby, sometimes helping, sometimes just watching with quiet pride. The transformation wasn't sudden. It was slow, earned, real. On the morning of day 14, Logan stood on the hospital room balcony, thin, pale, wrapped in a hospital robe, but standing on his own. He looked out over New York City like it was the first time he'd seen it. Keanu stepped out beside him. I forgot how alive this place feels, Logan said, like every window has a story. Keanu nodded. You've got your own story now. Logan turned toward him. I don't know how to repay you. You don't have to, Keanu replied. Just keep walking forward. The city below moved like a river. Cars, cabs, footsteps on sidewalks, lives in motion. And up above, on the 7th floor of a hospital not many people knew existed, a man who once stood behind others was learning to stand for himself. Logan Ward wasn't out of the woods yet, but for the first time in a long time he could see the edge of the forest. And standing next to him, quietly, faithfully, was the man who had never left his side. Spring crept slowly into New York. The snow had melted from the hospital's rooftop garden. replaced by soft buds of green pushing through the soil. Tulips began to wake, trees shook off their winter stillness, and the air smelled faintly of new beginnings. So did Logan Ward. Each morning he forced himself to sit up a little longer, breathe a little deeper, stand a little taller. The transplant had gone well, but the recovery was a separate mountain. Its own quiet war fought one shaky step at a time. Dr. Ramirez called it the fragile window. His immune system was rebuilding from scratch, every cell a question mark. Every cough, every drop in blood pressure, every minute of fatigue had to be monitored. But Logan pushed forward anyway. On day 16, he took his first walk without help. Keanu was there, of course, hands at the ready, steps steady beside him. Logan moved like a man learning his own body again. His legs were thinner, his gait slower, but every footfall was a small defiance against the shadow that had loomed for months. They walked the length of the corridor and back. Nurses clapped softly from their stations. One even wiped a tear. Logan collapsed into the chair afterward, sweat on his brow, heart racing, but alive and proud. "You looked good out there," Keanu said, handing him a cup of cold water. "Don't lie," Logan muttered. "I looked like a guy chasing down a bus that already left." Keanu laughed. "Yeah, but you still moved." By the end of the week, the walks became routine. Short strolls through the rooftop garden, Logan bundled in a thick coat. Ivy line still attached to his port, a knit cap covering his buzzed head. Keanu accompanied him, sometimes talking, sometimes silent. They didn't need to fill the space. The air did that. One morning, Keanu brought out a pack of sunflower seeds and poured a few into Logan's palm. They stood by a small flower bed as pigeons gathered curiously near their feet. "You ever think about what comes after this?" Keanu asked softly. Logan tilted his head. "After the hospital?" "Yeah." Logan was quiet for a beat. "I used to think there wasn't an after. I'd convinced myself that I'd be lucky just to die quietly." He tossed a seed to the ground and watched the birds scurry for it. "But now," he said, "I'm not so sure. Maybe there's still a road I haven't walked yet." Keanu nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the skyline. "There is, and it's yours." Later that day, a nurse entered the room holding a small envelope. "No return address," she said, handing it to Logan. The handwriting on the front was familiar, slightly angled, tight loops. Logan stared at it for a moment before carefully tearing it open. Inside was a short letter, written in black ink. "Logan, I meant to say more when I left, but I didn't know how. You and I didn't always see eye to eye, but I never stopped thinking of you as my brother, not just by blood, by spirit. You were always the strong one, the one who ran into danger without hesitation, and I was the one who stayed behind, angry at the way life split us up. But watching you fight this changed me. You've got a second chance now. Don't waste it. Don't disappear again. Do something that matters with the life you've got left. Marcus." Logan read the letter twice, his hands trembling slightly. When he finally looked up, Keanu was watching him. "He's right," Logan said, voice rough. Keanu nodded. "He is." Logan let the letter rest in his lap. His eyes were glassy, but he didn't wipe them. "Who saw something in me I didn't see in myself. You did too." "We just reminded you it was there," Keanu said. "You're the one who pulled it out." That night, Logan asked for his notebook, the small leather-bound journal he'd kept in his backpack for years but rarely touched. He opened it to the first blank page and wrote for nearly an hour. No one asked what he was writing. It didn't matter. It was for him. The next day, he asked to sit outside a little longer. They brought an extra blanket and a thermos of warm tea. Logan tilted his face to the sun, eyelids fluttering shut, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I forgot what warmth felt like," he murmured. "Real warmth. Not heat lamps or hospital vents, the kind that sinks into your skin." Keanu leaned back in the chair beside him. "It feels like hope," Logan chuckled. That's the first time I've laughed at something that corny in a while. Then you're really healing. They stayed there for hours, talking, remembering, dreaming. Keanu told stories from early film sets, how he once wiped out on a motorcycle 2 days before a shoot and still showed up because he didn't want to disappoint the stunt team. Logan shared memories of being stationed in Germany, of a kid he'd once pulled from a burning car in Kandahar, of how he used to play harmonica to calm his nerves before combat missions. They laughed. They paused. They honored the silences. And in those moments, Logan felt something that hadn't lived inside him in years. Permission to want more. Permission to live. When they returned to the room, Keanu noticed something different in Logan's walk. He was still slow, still sore, but his shoulders were straighter. He looked less like a patient and more like a man reclaiming himself. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the monitors beeped softly in the background, Logan turned to Keanu. "If I make it through this," he said, "I want to do something that matters." Keanu didn't hesitate. "Then you will." "I don't know what that looks like yet," Logan admitted, "but I'm done hiding behind jobs, behind missions, behind other people's safety. I want to be more than a shadow." Keanu nodded, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. "You already are." Outside, the last rays of light stretched across the city, painting the skyline in gold. Inside, a man who once lived in silence was beginning to speak, not with words, but with intention. And hope, soft and stubborn, was finally blooming. 2 weeks after Logan's white blood cell count crossed the critical threshold, Dr. Ramirez gave him the green light to begin outpatient recovery. The hospital staff clapped quietly as he left the oncology wing, bundled in a dark coat and scarf, the thinness in his face still visible, but his steps steady. Keanu didn't take him home. He took him somewhere quieter. 3 hours north of the city, nestled in the Catskills, sat a small private lodge that Keanu had rented for the month. It wasn't flashy, just a single-level wooden cabin with a wraparound porch, a roaring fireplace, and enough distance from the world to let a man breathe again. When they arrived, Logan stepped out of the car and just stood still. The sky was ink black above them, stars scattered like grains of salt, the kind of view he hadn't seen in years. There were no sirens here, no machines, just wind in the trees and the sound of his own heart, steady and alive. Inside, Keanu lit the fire while Logan explored slowly, fingering the worn books on the shelf, running his hand over the smooth stone mantel, breathing in the scent of pine wood and something that smelled like cinnamon. "This place is," Logan started, then trailed off. Keanu looked up from the firewood. "Quiet?" "Perfect," Logan said. That first night, they ate soup and bread, simple food that warmed the chest. Logan ate slowly, but with more appetite than he'd shown in weeks. After dinner, Keanu poured tea while Logan wrapped himself in a thick blanket and sat in one of the oversized chairs facing the fireplace. The flames danced like memories, flickering, elusive. It was Logan who spoke first. "You ever think about what your life would have been like if you weren't famous?" Keanu looked into the fire, thoughtful. "All the time." "What do you see?" Keanu leaned back, letting the warmth settle over him. "A mechanic, maybe. Something with my hands. Or maybe a teacher. Not because I'm good at explaining things, but because I like listening." Logan nodded. "I could see that." Keanu turned the question. "What about you? If not the Marines? If not bodyguard work, what then?" Logan was quiet for a long time. The fire popped softly. Wind rustled outside. "I used to think I didn't have a story," he said finally. "That I was just the guy who kept others safe while they lived theirs." "You weren't just that." "I know that now," Logan said. "But for most of my life, I didn't. I was trained to move quiet, think fast, speak only when necessary. I got so good at it, I started believing that silence was the same as peace." He paused, staring into the flames. "But silence isn't peace. It's just delay. And eventually, everything you don't deal with catches up." Keanu nodded, understanding deep in his eyes. Logan continued, "When I was in the hospital, I kept thinking about all the guys I knew, soldiers who came back with scars no one could see, who got lost in the system, or worse, decided to disappear." His voice caught, but he pushed through it. "I don't want to be one of them. Not anymore." Keanu sat forward, hands clasped. "What do you want?" "I want to help them. The ones like me. Veterans who can't ask for help, who think they've outlived their usefulness. I want to sit with them, hear their stories, and tell them what you told me." "What's that?" Keanu asked. "They're worth saving." The fire crackled between them, but the silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was full. Keanu smiled softly. "Then, that's what you'll do." Logan looked over, eyes searching. "You think I can?" "I know you can," Keanu said. "You've lived it. That's more than most people can say." Logan exhaled, the breath shaky but clear. "It's not going to be easy." "No," Keanu said. "But you weren't built for easy, you were built for purpose." They sat like that for a while. Two men who had walked very different roads, meeting at the same intersection, of pain, of healing, of second chances. Outside, the wind picked up, pushing branches against the cabin's side like soft knocks from the world beyond. Logan stood slowly and walked to the window. He looked out into the darkness, watching the trees sway. Then he turned back. "You ever think the universe puts people in your path for a reason?" he asked. Keanu gave a small smile. "Yeah, and I think sometimes we're too proud to realize it until it's almost too late." Logan nodded. "You showing up when you did. I still don't know why you did it." Keanu met his gaze. "Because I saw a man who was worth fighting for. Because you never asked for help, but gave it to everyone else. Because you once took a bullet to keep me breathing." He paused. "And because I wasn't going to let this world lose someone like you." Logan looked away, blinking fast. The fire's light shimmered against the wetness in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. "You don't have to thank me," Keanu said. "Just live the story you were meant to tell." Later that night, long after the fire had died to embers, Logan sat at the dining table with a fresh notebook in front of him. He wrote slowly, carefully, his handwriting rough but deliberate. When Keanu passed by on the way to bed, he paused. "What's that?" Logan looked up. "An outline." "For what?" "A support group," he said. "Veterans with cancer, trauma survivors. I don't know what to call it yet, but I know what I want it to be." Keanu smiled. "Good, because the world needs it." Logan nodded. "And I need to give it." In that quiet cabin, with the smell of firewood still lingering and the stars scattered across the black sky, Logan Ward began the next chapter of his life. Not as a bodyguard, not as a shadow, but as a man who had walked through the fire and come out whole. And beside him, still present, still steady, was the one person who had believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. The first time Logan walked through the doors of the South Hudson Veterans Resource Center, he felt a familiar tightening in his chest. It wasn't fear exactly, but something close, a hum of nerves he hadn't felt since his first mission. But this time, there was no weapon, no briefing, no protocol, just a room full of strangers waiting to be seen. The center sat inside a converted church on the edge of the city. Simple walls, folding chairs, and a circle of worn couches that formed the heart of the Thursday night support group for veterans undergoing cancer treatment. Some had just been diagnosed, others were halfway through chemo. A few had already lost limbs to other wars before this one began. Logan took a seat in the back at first, didn't speak, just listened. The men and women there didn't talk like patients. They talked like warriors. They shared stories about fear, about faith, about what it felt like to be forgotten, and something in those stories cracked open a part of Logan that had stayed hidden even during his sickest days. The second week he spoke. Not much, just a few words, but enough for the group to pause and really hear him. The third week, he brought coffee. The fourth, he filled in for the group leader who had to miss a session. No one asked him to. He just stepped up. By the end of the second month, Logan was leading sessions on his own. He'd found something. Or maybe it had found him. In the mornings, he volunteered at the center's clinic, helping transport wheelchair-bound patients and organizing ride shares for appointments. In the afternoons, he studied online for his trauma counseling certification, a program tailored for veterans by veterans. His days were full, not busy, full. And in the quiet moments between meetings, he'd sometimes sit by the window with a cup of tea and think about how far he'd come. Keanu visited once a week. He never made a big entrance, just slipped into the back of the support group, sometimes staying silent, sometimes speaking gently if someone asked about the guy who helped Logan. Everyone knew who he was, but they treated him like anyone else. Lord liked that. One afternoon, Logan arrived early to prep the main room and found one of the program coordinators, Jenna, taping a flyer to the community bulletin board. "What's that?" Logan asked, hanging his coat. "A grant announcement," she said. "You haven't seen it?" He stepped closer and scanned the flyer. The headline read, "New Recovery Grant for Veterans Battling Cancer, the LW Strength Initiative." His brows furrowed. "What's LW?" Jenna turned to him, surprised. "It's you." Logan blinked. "What?" "It's your name. L.Y. Logan Ward. The foundation said it was anonymously funded, but they used your initials and story as inspiration for the whole thing." He stared at the paper like it was written in another language. "A foundation?" "Yeah. It's covering treatment support, travel, counseling, even family housing during chemo. They've already funded 20 applicants." Logan stepped back, stunned. He hadn't applied for any grant, hadn't written a single word about himself to any organization. And yet, here it was, his story, his initials, quietly lifting the weight off others. And he knew, immediately, unquestionably, who had done it. That night, he called Keanu. "You did this," Logan said the moment Keanu picked up. There was a pause. "I didn't want you to find out like that," Keanu said, voice calm. "You named it after me." "I didn't name it. The people who run it did. I just funded it." "Why didn't you say anything?" Keanu was silent for a moment. "Because this wasn't about me." Logan sat down slowly at his kitchen table. His hands were still shaking, but not from weakness this time. From something else. From the realization that someone had seen the value in his pain and turned it into purpose. "You changed lives," Logan said. "So did you," Keanu replied. "No," Logan said. "You could have just helped me and walked away. Instead, you gave hundreds of people a chance." Keanu's voice softened. "You were never the only one hurting, Logan. You just had the courage to let someone in. Now others will have the same chance." Logan closed his eyes, absorbing the weight of it all. For most of his life, he had operated in the shadows. Behind clients, behind glass, behind guns and protocols. And for the first time, something with his name on it was out there helping people. Not because he sought it, but because someone believed his survival meant something. The next time he walked into the support group, someone clapped. Then another. Soon, the entire room was on their feet, applauding not because he was famous, not because he was strong, but because he'd made it. And because he'd come back to show others that they could, too. After the session, an older veteran approached him. Vietnam era. Thin frame, rough hands. "You're the guy, right?" he asked. "The one who started the grant?" Logan hesitated. "Not exactly." "Doesn't matter," the man said. "My daughter can finally stay close while I go through treatment. Haven't seen her in 3 years, but now, she's coming tomorrow." He stuck out his hand. Logan took it. That night, Logan sat in his apartment and opened the journal he'd started in the hospital. He flipped past pages filled with memories, ideas, grief, and gratitude. And on a fresh page, he wrote just 5 words. "I'm not done. Not even close." He smiled, closed the notebook, and looked out at the moonlit street. The world had changed since he got sick. But more importantly, he had. And somewhere across town, Keanu Reeves sat quietly in his own home, unaware that a letter had just been written, a room of veterans had just stood in gratitude, and that the quiet gift he gave was changing lives more than he'd ever know. The walls of the pediatric oncology wing were painted with bright murals, sunflowers, rocket ships, cartoon lions holding hands. The colors tried to lift the room, but the air still felt heavy in places. Beneath the laughter and nurses' cheerful tones was the silent, stubborn ache of children fighting a war far too early. Logan Ward stood just outside room 204, gripping a small notebook in one hand and the doorframe in the other. His boots felt heavier than usual, his pulse louder in his ears. "Ready?" the nurse beside him asked gently. He nodded. "Yeah, let's do it." Inside the room, a boy no older than 10 sat in a reclining chair, wrapped in a fleece blanket shaped like a superhero cape. His name was Aiden. He had leukemia and had recently been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder after a particularly violent seizure left him in the ICU. He didn't talk much anymore, didn't smile either. But his mother had told the staff that Aiden loved two things: comic books and military heroes. Logan stepped inside quietly. He didn't wear a suit or carry the usual commanding posture that used to define his presence. Instead, he wore a gray zip-up hoodie, jeans, and a thin beanie over his shaved head. He looked like a man who had seen pain and lived through it. Aiden looked up, curious but guarded. "Hey," Logan said, lowering himself into the seat beside the bed. "I heard you're a fan of superheroes." The boy gave a slight shrug. Logan reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, worn comic book. "I used to carry this with me when I was deployed overseas," he said. "Every mission. Kind of a good luck charm." He handed it over. Aiden took it, slowly flipping through the pages. Logan watched him carefully. His hands were small and pale, an IV taped along the back of one. "I've been in a few tough spots," Logan continued, voice low and calm. "I used to be a Marine. Then I worked in security, protected people. It was my job to stand in front of danger and make sure others didn't get hurt." Aiden glanced at him, eyes sharp behind the fatigue. "Then one day I got sick, not like a cold, like you. Something in the blood." "You had cancer?" Aiden whispered. Logan nodded. "Polycythemia vera, rare stuff. I didn't even know what it was until I collapsed one morning, woke up in the hospital. The doctors said I was in real trouble." "Were you scared?" Logan smiled faintly. "Terrified. I'd been through firefights, ambushes, a car bomb once. Nothing scared me like hearing that I might not make it. But I wasn't alone." Aiden turned to him. "Did someone help you?" Logan's eyes softened. "Yeah, a friend. Someone who stuck by me even when I didn't ask for it, even when I thought I didn't deserve it." "Like a sidekick?" Aiden asked. "More like a partner, quiet, strong, always there." Aiden nodded, understanding. "I wish I had someone like that." "You do," Logan said. "Look around. Your mom, the nurses, the doctors, they're not wearing capes, but they're here, every day." Aiden didn't respond, but he held the comic tighter. Logan reached into his bag again and pulled out a small metal coin. It was a challenge coin, one given to him years ago after a successful mission overseas. He held it out. "This is yours now," Logan said. "It's heavy, but not just in weight. It means you've earned something. You've fought something real and come through the other side." Aiden took it slowly, cradling it in his hands, like a treasure. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Aiden whispered, "You're kind of like a real-life superhero." Logan blinked, caught off guard by the words. "I'm just a guy who got lucky," he said. Aiden shook his head. "No. You came back, and now you're here. That's what heroes do." From the back of the room, a quiet figure leaned against the doorframe. Keanu. He had arrived 20 minutes earlier, staying out of sight to give Logan space. But now he stepped forward, arms folded, watching the exchange with quiet pride. Logan turned and caught his eye. Keanu gave the smallest nod. Logan smiled, turning back to Aiden. I think your story's just beginning, buddy, and someday someone's gonna say, you helped them get through their fight. Aiden didn't speak, but he smiled, for the first time in days. That was enough. After the visit, Logan stepped out into the hallway and exhaled like he'd just walked out of a battlefield. His shoulders sagged, his hands trembled slightly. Keanu walked beside him, neither man speaking for several minutes. They exited through the back of the hospital, the afternoon light falling in soft beams across the parking lot. She called me a superhero, Logan said quietly. Keanu smiled. Well, she's not wrong. I didn't expect that. You didn't expect to survive either, Keanu said. But you did. And now, you're showing others how to do the same. They stopped at the car, the engine still off, keys dangling from Keanu's fingers. Logan turned to him. I thought the hardest part would be surviving, but this? Showing up for other people? It's a different kind of hard. Keanu nodded. But it's the kind that matters. They climbed into the car, driving in silence for a while. On the dashboard, Logan had placed the letter Marcus had sent him, now folded neatly into a small leather wallet. You know, Logan said, breaking the silence, I've never really believed in destiny or fate. But this, everything that's happened, it feels like something bigger. Keanu kept his eyes on the road. Sometimes we don't see the reason until we've been through the fire. Logan chuckled. You always have a poetic line ready? No, Keanu said. Just been listening more lately. They arrived back at the lodge just before sunset. The trees were turning golden, shadows stretching long across the gravel drive. Logan stepped out slowly, inhaling the crisp mountain air. That night, they sat by the fire again, 2 cups of tea between them, the warmth spreading from the hearth out into the quiet of the room. Keanu spoke first. You know, when I first brought you here, I thought maybe I was just helping a friend get back on his feet. But it's more than that. You've become something else. Logan raised an eyebrow. Like what? A symbol, Keanu said. For those who've felt invisible. For the ones who don't know they're allowed to be helped. Logan shook his head. I'm no symbol. You are, Keanu said firmly. Because you didn't just come back. You chose to give back. That's rare. Logan looked into the flames, his reflection flickering in the glass. I never thought this would be my life, he said. But now, I don't want anything else. Then don't stop, Keanu said. I won't. The fire crackled, filling the space between their words with warmth. And somewhere in the city, a child slept with a challenge coin under their pillow, feeling, maybe for the first time in weeks, like they weren't alone. Because a quiet man had walked into their room, shared his story, and left behind something stronger than medicine. Hope? 6 months. That's how long it had been since the transplant. The day Logan closed his eyes in that sterile hospital room and silently wondered if he'd ever open them again. Now he stood upright in the hallway of the same hospital, healthier than anyone had dared to hope. His gait was solid, his skin had color, and his eyes, clearer now, carried the calm steadiness of a man who'd walked through fire and come out the other side. The checkup was routine, just another box to check off on the long list of follow-up evaluations. But something about this visit felt heavier, not with dread, but with anticipation. Logan tried not to show it. He kept his tone casual as he chatted with the front desk nurse. He joked with the tech drawing his blood, but inside, the anxiety pulsed beneath his ribs like a second heartbeat. He wasn't afraid of bad news. He was afraid of hope. Keanu sat beside him in the waiting room, legs crossed, quiet as ever. He didn't ask questions or offer pep talks. He just waited, like he always had. Dr. Ramirez finally appeared, her white coat fluttering slightly as she walked toward them, a folder tucked under her arm. Logan, she said with a warm smile, come on back. They followed her into a private exam room where sunlight streamed through a window, lighting the wood-paneled walls. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. Logan sat down. Keanu stood just behind him, leaning against the far wall. Dr. Ramirez opened the folder and glanced down at the lab results. "You've always been a little unpredictable," she began, "but today, that works in your favor." Logan straightened, heart pounding. "Your marrow is fully engrafted," she continued. "No signs of mutation. Red and white counts are stable, platelets within range." She looked up, her smile growing. "You're in remission, Logan." The words landed like a thunderclap in a quiet field. Not loud, just monumental. Keanu's arms dropped to his sides. Logan blinked. "I'm what?" "Officially in remission," Dr. Ramirez repeated. "Your recovery's been nothing short of remarkable. To be honest, I've never seen this kind of turnaround from someone at your stage." Logan's throat tightened. His hands trembled slightly, but not from weakness. This time, from the flood of something he hadn't dared let in until now. Relief. Real, honest, earth-shaking relief. He lowered his head and let out a long breath, eyes closed. When he looked up, Keanu was watching him, his gaze steady, but glistening with quiet emotion. "I don't even know what to say," Logan whispered. "You don't have to," Keanu said softly. Dr. Ramirez folded her hands on the table. "Actually, I'd like to say something else," she added. "The protocol we used for your treatment, the way we combined phlebotomy cycles, marrow prep, and immune support, it wasn't standard." Logan looked puzzled. "It wasn't?" "No, it was experimental. We'd been working on a new approach for months, but we didn't have the funding to properly test it. At least not until a private donor stepped in and funded the research." Logan glanced at Keanu, who looked away for just a second. Dr. Ramirez smiled. He insisted the donation be anonymous, but the paperwork, well, it was filed under a foundation with the initials LW. Logan's brow furrowed. "Wait." Keanu stepped forward slowly. "I knew you wouldn't want the spotlight," he said, "but I couldn't sit by and do nothing. So I talked to the hospital's research board, learned what they needed, and set up the funding quietly." Logan stared at him, stunned. "You funded the protocol that saved my life?" Keanu nodded once. "Not just yours. The way Dr. Ramirez tells it, it could help hundreds of others, maybe thousands." Ramirez chimed in. "We're already seeing grant interest from other institutions. Your results are going to be published in 2 journals next quarter. And we've had 3 other patients respond just as strongly in early trials." She smiled at Logan. "You didn't just survive, Logan. You became the foundation for something much bigger." Logan sat back in the chair, his mind spinning. His name, his initials, on research that could change how doctors treat blood cancer across the country. And he hadn't even known. All because someone believed in him more than he believed in himself. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, turning to Keanu. Keanu shook his head. "You already did. You lived." After the appointment, they stepped outside into the spring sunshine. The city hummed with life around them. Horns blaring in the distance, people laughing over lunch. Children pulling at their parents' sleeves near the park across the street. But for Logan, the world had never looked so still, so beautiful. He leaned against the railing outside the hospital and looked up at the sky, blinking back the tears that pressed at the corners of his eyes. "I was ready to go," he said. "I'd made peace with it. I thought, maybe that was all my story was ever meant to be." "And now?" Keanu asked. Logan smiled. "Now I feel like I'm just getting to the good part." They walked for a while. Through the park, past the playground. Logan took everything in. The breeze, the smell of food carts on the corner, the sound of a guitar being played nearby. It was all familiar and brand new. Back at the lodge that evening, Logan pulled out his notebook and flipped to the first page. He reread everything he'd written during his recovery. Notes about pain, healing, guilt, and hope. Then he turned to a fresh page. He wrote slowly, carefully. "Day 1 of the rest of my life." Later that night, as the fire burned low, he turned to Keanu. "Do you ever wonder why you're still here?" Keanu considered the question. Sometimes? Logan stared into the flames. I think I'm starting to get it. I think I survived so I could show others that they can too. Keanu smiled. That's exactly why. Logan nodded. And I'm going to do something with it. More than just a group, more than just stories. I want to build something. A place. A real home base for veterans like me. You already have, Keanu said. But if you're thinking of making it bigger, just say the word. Logan looked over at him. You'd help me? Keanu chuckled. Was that ever in question? They clinked mugs, Keanu's full of coffee, Logan's filled with warm lemon water, and let the silence stretch comfortably between them. Outside, the stars blinked into view one by one. And inside, a man who had once been prepared to die was now planning how to live. The invitation came in a short text. Dinner at my place, 7 p.m., just us. Come hungry. K. Logan stared at the message on his phone, a small smile forming on his face. He was nearly 4 weeks into full remission now, and though his body was still regaining strength, his steps felt lighter with each passing day. The shadows under his eyes had faded, and the constant dull ache that had once lived in his bones was gone. Dinner at Keanu's house wasn't just an invitation. It was a shift. For a decade, Logan had entered Keanu's homes as a protector, quiet, alert, always watching the exits. But tonight would be different. He wasn't there as a bodyguard. He was going as a friend. Logan pulled into the long driveway just before sunset. The house sat nestled in the hills above Los Angeles, modest compared to celebrity standards, but warm and inviting. He knocked once, but before he could lift his hand again, the door opened. Keanu stood there barefoot, dressed in jeans and a black crew neck, holding a dish towel in one hand. You're early, Keanu said with a grin. Old habits, Logan replied. Always scan the perimeter before the mission starts. Keanu laughed and stepped aside. Come on in, food's almost ready. The house smelled of roasted garlic and rosemary. Somewhere in the background, a jazz record played low, soft saxophone curling through the air like smoke. Logan followed Keanu into the open kitchen, where a skillet sizzled and a pot simmered on the stove. You cook now? Logan asked, impressed. I dabble, Keanu said, flipping a piece of salmon with practiced ease. Figured you deserved something better than takeout. Logan looked around the space. Clean countertops, shelves lined with books, framed photos and little mementos from film sets. It felt lived in, real. Not curated for attention, but built for peace. You good with sparkling water? Keanu asked. Perfect. They sat at a reclaimed wood table just off the kitchen, plates full, conversation easy. Logan couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed this much in one sitting. Keanu's stories about botched stunts and awkward award show moments had a way of breaking down the last walls of formality between them. But it was the quiet between stories that meant the most. At one point, Logan glanced around the room and noticed a small picture frame on the bookshelf. He stood and walked over, drawn to it without quite knowing why. It was a photo of the two of them, taken months ago during Logan's recovery. They were sitting outside the hospital, side by side, in the rooftop garden. Logan's head was shaved, his frame thin, but he was smiling. Genuinely smiling. Keanu sat beside him, a book in hand, looking down with a peaceful expression. Logan stared at the photo for a long time. I didn't know you kept this, he said, quietly. Keanu looked up from his seat. It's one of my favorites. Why? Keanu leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. Because it wasn't a moment for the press or a red carpet. It was just us. No roles, no expectations. Logan placed the frame back gently. He returned to the table and sat down. I think I stopped seeing myself as a person somewhere along the way, he said. Started feeling more like a function, a role. Stay alert, stay quiet, take the hit. Keanu met his gaze. But you were always more than that. Logan nodded slowly. I know that now, thanks to you. There was a pause, and then Logan spoke the words he hadn't said, not in full, not out loud. "You saved my life." Keanu didn't flinch, didn't dismiss it. But he didn't accept the credit either. He looked at Logan for a long moment, then said, "No, I just reminded you that it was worth saving." Logan swallowed hard. He looked away briefly, gathering himself. The fire crackled softly in the nearby hearth, filling the silence with warmth instead of tension. "You know," Logan said, "there were nights, dark ones, when I thought about just disappearing, before I collapsed, before the hospital. I didn't want to die. I just didn't want to be seen falling apart." Keanu's voice was steady. "You didn't fall apart. You broke open. And then you healed." "Still healing," Logan said. "Aren't we all?" Keanu replied. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the way only people who had shared real pain could. Logan looked around the room again, appreciating the details he'd never noticed before. A guitar propped against the wall, an old dog-eared copy of The Catcher in the Rye, a movie poster, not one of Keanu's, but a black and white vintage print of To Kill a Mockingbird. "This place feels like you," Logan said. Keanu smiled. "That's the idea. Took me a while to let my house be a home." Logan leaned back in his chair. "I think I'm ready to find that for myself. Not just a place to sleep, but something that feels like it fits." "You will," Keanu said. "And when you do, it'll be because you built it, just like you rebuilt yourself." They moved to the living room after dinner, settling into deep armchairs by the fire. Keanu poured herbal tea this time, and they sipped slowly, the room filled with the golden hum of embers and soft music. Logan spoke about the support group, how one of the vets had gotten a job teaching high school, how another had just completed a full chemo cycle with no signs of spread. Keanu listened, visibly moved. "You created something," he said, "something lasting." Logan smiled. "Still feels surreal sometimes." "Real things usually do," Keanu said. The clock ticked past 10. Neither of them moved to end the night. Time had lost its usual pressure. They were two men who had spent much of their lives bracing for impact, and now, for once, they were simply sitting still. Logan glanced at Keanu. "Do you miss the old days, when I was watching your back every second?" Keanu smirked. "I think you still are, just in a different way. It feels good not to be scanning rooms for threats. Feels good to just talk," Keanu said. "To know that when we sit across from each other now, it's not about work, it's about friendship." Logan nodded. "Yeah, you're not a client anymore." "And you're not a shadow," Keanu replied. The fire popped softly, casting their faces in flickering amber. They didn't need to say more, because somewhere between the cancer diagnosis and the quiet rooftop walks, between the nights of pain and the afternoons filled with hope, the dynamic had shifted. No longer protector and protected, just two men who had walked beside each other long enough to call it what it truly was. Brotherhood. The building wasn't grand. It didn't need to be. Tucked into a quiet block in downtown Denver, the structure looked like any other renovated community center. Red brick, fresh windows, a wide front ramp beside the stairs. But inside, something far greater than architecture was coming to life. On the glass door, a simple decal read, "The Ward Foundation, Veterans, Recovery, Purpose." Logan stood just outside the entrance that morning, a light wind tugging at his jacket, watching as the first small crowd of guests arrived for the launch event. Some wore suits. Others arrived in faded service jackets, military pins still proudly fixed above their hearts. Cancer survivors, active-duty soldiers, social workers, volunteers, and standing off to one side, helping direct foot traffic into the hall, was Marcus Ward. "Still surreal, huh?" Marcus asked as he stepped beside Logan. Logan nodded. "I thought I'd be dead by now. Instead, I'm hosting a ribbon cutting." Marcus smiled. "And you're doing it with style. Got your name on a building and everything." "Not the goal," Logan said, adjusting the cuff of his shirt. "The goal was always people. This is just the door that gets them inside." Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder. Well, you kicked that door wide open. Inside, the event space had been transformed. Rows of chairs faced a simple wooden podium flanked by two flags, one American, the other bearing the Foundation's emblem, a rising phoenix wrapped around a medical caduceus. A projection screen behind the stage played a slow reel of photos, Logan's journey from diagnosis to remission, intercut with snapshots of other veterans now receiving care through the Foundation's early pilot program. In the front row sat 6 individuals, each one a cancer survivor from a military background, and each one the beneficiary of the very mission Logan had set out to build. They represented the first group supported by the Ward Foundation's inaugural fund. Keanu arrived quietly, dressed in a dark suit with no tie, his signature calm presence drawing attention without demanding it. He greeted staff, shook hands with survivors, and eventually made his way over to Logan. "Place looks incredible," Keanu said, eyes scanning the space. "Still can't believe it's real," Logan replied. "It's not just real," Keanu said. "It's necessary." The program began shortly after noon. A community liaison welcomed everyone. A veteran spoke briefly about his experience navigating cancer treatment with no support. A mother read a letter her son had written before passing away, his final words urging others to fight, not just for survival, but for dignity. Then it was Logan's turn. He stepped to the podium, steady but solemn, holding no notes. "My name is Logan Ward," he began. "For most of my life, I stood behind others, watching for danger, stepping in when things went wrong. I thought my role in the world was simple: protect and disappear." He paused, the room hushed. "But then I got sick, and suddenly I couldn't stand behind anyone. I couldn't protect anyone. I was the one who needed help, and I didn't know how to ask for it." He looked out at the faces in the crowd. "What saved me wasn't medicine alone, it was people. People who refused to let me vanish into silence. People who showed up, sat beside me, believed in me, when I didn't believe in myself." He glanced toward Keanu, who gave a small, respectful nod. "This foundation isn't about one man. It's about the many who've served this country and come home to fight a different kind of war, a war inside their own bodies, a war made harder by pride, by fear, by lack of resources. We're here to say, you don't have to fight it alone." A ripple of emotion passed through the audience. "We fund treatment. We provide transportation, housing, trauma counseling, but most importantly, we restore the one thing that illness tries to steal: purpose." He stepped back from the podium to a standing ovation. But the moment wasn't over. The event host returned to the stage and introduced the final speaker. "Please welcome someone who has stood beside this mission from the very beginning, actor and humanitarian, Keanu Reeves." Keanu stepped up with characteristic humility. No notes, no showmanship, just a presence that immediately stilled the room. "I've been lucky in this life," he began, "not because of movies, but because I've met people like Logan Ward." He looked over at Logan. "He once told me he thought his story was over, but I saw a different ending, one where the man who'd spent his life in the shadows stepped into the light, not for himself, but for everyone else who thought they had no one." He turned back to the audience. "This isn't about me. It's about all of you who never ask for help until someone forces you to accept it. It's about every veteran who walks into a hospital alone, wondering if anyone still remembers their name." A beat of silence. "I'm here to say, we remember. We're not going anywhere." The room erupted in applause again, many wiping tears from their cheeks. After the speeches, the reception began. Light food, soft music, quiet conversations. Logan mingled with donors, hugged survivors, and watched as Marcus shared jokes with one of the Foundation's new caseworkers. At one point, Logan stepped away and found Keanu by a window, sipping a cup of black coffee. "You always this good at speeches?" Logan asked, smiling. Keanu shrugged. "Only when the subject's worth it." Logan leaned against the wall beside him. "Today felt like a dream," he said. "No," Keanu said. Today felt like legacy. They watched the crowd for a while, strangers connecting, old friends reuniting, people who had come in search of something, finding each other in ways they never expected. "You did this," Keanu added. "Every step you took, every story you told, every time you showed up, when it would have been easier to walk away." Logan looked down for a moment, humbled. "I just didn't want anyone else to feel the way I felt. Alone. Broken. And because of that," Keanu said, "they won't have to." Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the building's brick in gold and orange. The first day of the Ward Foundation had come to a close. But its story, Logan's story, was only just beginning. The city moved around him like a steady tide. Parents pushing strollers, nurses arriving for shift changes, taxis humming by in the dusk. But Logan stood still, grounded in a moment that felt suspended in time. He was outside the East Side Children's Cancer Hospital, standing just beyond the curved glass doors where families walked in with fear and came out with fragile hope. He'd visited before, quietly, without fanfare. Today was no different. No speech, no fanfare, just presence. His hand rested over the badge pinned to his chest. It wasn't a badge of rank or status. It wasn't from the Marines or his years in private security. It was a simple, brushed steel emblem, the insignia of the Ward Foundation, worn by every volunteer who completed training to serve alongside young cancer patients and their families. He looked out at the sidewalk, watching a boy with no hair and bright red sneakers pull a wagon carrying his IV bag. A young woman, his mother perhaps, walked beside him, fingers interlaced with his. Logan smiled softly, the edges of his eyes crinkling with something between peace and gratitude. Behind him, the automatic doors slid open. Keanu stepped out. He wore a plain gray jacket, hands in his pockets, a subtle smile playing on his lips. "Thought I might find you here," he said. Logan didn't turn at first, just kept his eyes on the street. "I like coming here," he said. "Helps me remember why I'm still standing." Keanu stepped beside him. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the world carry on. Then Keanu spoke again, this time quieter, his voice lower, more deliberate. "You once told me you didn't think you had a story," he said. Logan nodded. "I remember." "Well," Keanu said, "now you're the reason other people believe they can change theirs." Logan let out a slow breath, the kind you release when something inside you finally settles. He turned to Keanu. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me that morning?" Keanu didn't hesitate. "Every day." "And what do you think?" Keanu looked him in the eye. "I think that was the moment I was meant to stop being protected and start protecting someone else." Logan didn't respond right away, but the emotion in his expression spoke volumes. A group of volunteers exited the building behind them, their voices low and warm as they said goodbye to one another. Logan nodded to each of them as they passed. One gave him a gentle fist bump. Keanu glanced at the doors, then back to Logan. "You heading in?" "Not tonight," Logan said. "Sometimes it's enough just to be nearby. Let the kids see someone who's been through it and made it out." He paused. "Someone who looks like a survivor." Keanu nodded. Then his voice shifted, low, steady, reflective, as if it were no longer just a conversation, but something larger. Something meant to reach beyond the moment, beyond the sidewalk, beyond the story itself. "Sometimes the people who stand silently beside us," Keanu said slowly, "are fighting their own battles. They don't wear signs. They don't ask for help. They carry the weight in silence, not because they're fearless, but because they think they have to be. We often walk past them. We assume they're fine because they never flinch, never ask for more than they're given. But beneath the surface, there's a war we can't see. And when you choose to stop, to ask, to care, that moment can change everything." The camera of life would hold on Logan then, standing in the golden-orange hue of sunset, his hand on his badge, his expression one of quiet pride. The same man who once faded into corners now stood proudly in the open, no longer hiding behind duty, illness, or shame. Because when you give someone hope, Keanu's voice echoed, you're not just saving their life. You're reminding them that it's worth saving in the first place. A breeze lifted the edge of Logan's jacket as he turned toward the entrance, holding the door open for a nurse pushing a wheelchair. The child in the chair beamed at Logan as he passed. Logan gave him a small nod, no words, just connection. Inside the hospital lobby, the light was warm and inviting. Paintings lined the walls, a mural of handprints, each belonging to a child who had completed treatment, stretched across the corridor. Logan followed the boy and nurse in, not as a patient, not as a soldier, but as a man who had learned that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, it listens, it stays, it shows up. And in showing up, it saves lives. If you have a chance to give someone hope, take it. Even if it's just one person, even if it's just one moment, because that's all it takes. One spark, one act, one choice, to care. If this incredible story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope. Tell us in the comments, who's the silent hero in your life? Subscribe to the channel for more powerful true stories that remind us what courage, kindness, and loyalty really look like.